and welcome to the Practical Creative Podcast, where I talk to people about the how and why of creativity. I want to know more about their materials, their processes, what it is that motivates or inspires them to keep creating. I'm also interested in exploring the practicalities of being a creative person. And in this series of the podcast, I'm exploring the business of creativity, the skills and mindsets creatives use to share, promote, and sell their work. I'm Jeremiah Craigie, and in this episode, I'll be talking with Pete Mosley. Pete is a writer, coach, and speaker. He's also the author of the book, The Art of Shouting Quietly, A Guide to Self-Promotion for Introverts and Other Quiet Souls, which is aimed at brilliant people out there who have fabulous products and services, but who struggle to promote themselves through shyness, introversion, or a mistrust of the marketing process. And in this conversation, we cover a number of topics from the book and Pete's wider experience of coaching people in communicating the value of their work. These include practical strategies for identifying your own key values, and we also cover why this is so important, how quietness can be a strength even in marketing, how to find and use the voices of others to help promote your work, practical steps you can take to protect yourself from plagiarism when sharing your work online, and ways to think about and build confidence. Pete's gentle and considered approach offers an inspiring alternative to anyone who's uncomfortable with the idea of selling and promoting their work. Could you tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure, my name's Pete Mosley, and I'm a writer and a coach and a speaker. And I focus a lot of my time on working with quiet people, mainly because I am a quiet person myself, and helping quiet people find a place for themselves in the world, in a very noisy world, actually, helping them build their confidence and helping them find ways to connect with their audience, whoever and wherever they are. The reason I wrote the book, The Art of Shouting Quietly, is because I noticed that I was working with an awful lot of people that were absolutely brilliant at what they do, but when it came to self-promotion, they were a bit shy of that, or some, in fact, found it a little bit distasteful, the notion of marketing. They found it to be a bit tacky. So the challenge was for me to write the book that would help them get round those things.
Fantastic. Yes. And that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you is in the course of putting together this series of the podcast, I've been speaking to a lot of people who have experience in marketing, either as artists or coaches for artists, or they do PR on behalf of artists. And so many of them are really comfortable or have become comfortable with sales and self-promotion, but it's not something that seems to come naturally to creative people. I mean, obviously there will be exceptions, but I was wondering if you had a feeling about why that might be. Is there some inherent disconnect between a creative mind and a sales-oriented mind?
I think it's often a question of focus, and really what creative people want to be doing is focusing on making the stuff they're really good at making.
Absolutely.
And in some senses, a lot of them sit there hoping an audience is going to come along, or a gallery is going to ask for their work, or a patron's going to arrive out of the blue and kind of take that responsibility away from them. But that, as you know, doesn't happen very often, and therefore they end up confronting the fact that they're going to have to market themselves, and then end up getting very confused about what they do and what platforms they should use and what they should focus on. And of course, we live in a world where we're pretty much all storytellers now. We're forced into storytelling mode. And if you're not a person that enjoys writing or constructing words about things, then that can be really difficult, really. And I think that's where, the first problems arrive is, if I've got to market myself, it means I've got to write about myself, which isn't exactly true, but it's an idea that comes to most people. There's a huge correlation between creativity and dyslexia. Studies show that about 50 to 60% of the creative community have dyslexia to some degree or another, and therefore that also gets in the way. A lot of the coaching that I do is around helping people figure out how they can tell a multifaceted story that doesn't rely simply on them having to write stuff.
That's interesting. Okay, because I hadn't quite made the connection with language, and that's a really interesting distinction to make, in that
Mm,
we're often working in an imaginative landscape, and often in a very visual or
yeah,
basically in media or a way of thinking that are outside of language, or we're
yeah,
creating a different language, an emotional
yeah,
language,
yeah,
a color language, a palette.
yeah,
So yeah, I can see how that then adds an extra level of challenge to
yeah.
communication when you're having to almost translate what you do into quite a tricky medium, because language is very specific, and there are a lot
Hmm.
of nuances and levels to the words and the way we put them together and how they are interpreted by other people.
Yeah,
As we all know from the tone that we read in emails and texts, and like, which
yeah,
may not be what we intended, but other people read. So that's really interesting from that point of view. I'm also curious to know what you feel lies at the heart of so many people's discomfort with the idea of promoting themselves. So not just the medium through which they do it, of having to translate what they do into words, but also there is often a sense of dis-ease with the idea of selling and of self-promotion, that somehow that doesn't fit with the image of what an artist is, or the motivation for creating the
E-
work, and that almost
yeah,
that they are antithetical, that they don't fit together and can't fit together.
yeah, yeah. The world is full of marketing messages. It's really hard to move around without bumping into a marketing message or a sales message some way. Every time we go out the house, every time we pick up something to read, it's just there. It's a constant in our lives, and therefore there's the question of where do I find my place in all that? How can I possibly become visible? And B, do I really want to be mimicking all that heavy sales stuff that's going on out there? Do I really need to do the same things that everybody else is doing?
Mm.
And the distaste also arises there. And I work with people to help them find different solutions where they're relying not on a sales message, but on a values based message where they're communicating what it is they think, feel, and believe about the thing that they're making or doing, rather than trying to think up features and benefits and sales talk around it. Because if folk really love what you do, actually, they're going to come on board on the basis of a shared value system around that beautiful thing that you've made, or the software that you've written that's so elegant, or whatever it happens to be.
That's fantastic, because that's putting together this whole series of the podcast has been very, for me, personal, as much as it has been something I've wanted to share with other people. This idea of selling and self-promotion is something that I have been uncomfortable with, and I've become more open to it and developed a wider vocabulary for thinking about it in the course of doing these interviews. But one of the things that comes back time and time again is this notion of shared values. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, this morning I was just talking to somebody who works at the South Bank Centre in London. So it's a massive 17-acre site, and they've got multiple venues, and they've got everything from opera to rock bands, and they've got free stuff, and they've got stuff that you have to buy tickets for, and they serve a really wide audience. And they were saying that they can't rely solely on public funding. They have to partner with other businesses. And I was asking, does that ever cause a problem with perhaps a more commercial agenda influencing their programming and the kinds of messages that they're putting out? And and the response was that actually no, it's finding business partners who share the same values, even on that scale, and working on a really huge palette or canvas with big commercial partners. It still comes down to this notion of shared
Mm-hmm.
values. And I was really struck by the fact that that comes up when talking about interpersonal conversations between one artist and one potential buyer, and when it comes to something as large as a cultural institution such as the South Bank. So I'm curious to know, because I know you've written about values,
Yeah,
and I'm curious to know how do we know what our values are? How do we identify
yeah,
them? There's a quote of yours that I found really interesting. You say here, it's important to work from a baseline of strong personal values, and values that are your own. And this is where I think it gets tricky, because you say neither values pushed upon you by others or acquired by osmosis through the Me Too collective unconscious of social media. And I think that you've really put your finger on something, is that we are subject to so many messages from so many vested interests who are all pushing values on us. how do we identify? How do we think clearly? How do we separate ourselves from the noise in order to be clear about what is genuinely my value versus something I might have adopted?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of ways to approach finding your own key values. One is to think about the environment you grew up in as a kid, and the kind of parental values and the social values that were going on around you in your younger years, because we tend to absorb those by osmosis, and that's only right and fair. You know, I grew up as a little boy in a house next to the church, and my mum was a keen churchgoer, so a lot of my values about leading a good life and treating other people the way that I would wish to be treated came from that very early experience. Now, I'm not a practicing Christian, but actually there's a lot of very sound social values that I picked up from there. The other is, as we get older and we join our tribe or our niche as a teenager and begin to pick up value systems from our peers around music and art and culture, we tend to select fairly carefully values within that sit really closely with those really early values, core values that we've got. And then we begin, if we have our own business, to look at other brands and other makers and other people doing what we do and trying to work out what it is that we love about what they do. And I think that's a great question to ask yourself. If you're looking to set some values out for yourself, what is it that you want your customers or your audience to love about what you do? And make a list, you know, come down with a definitive list of those factors and values. You know, do you want to give them really great service? Do you want to give them beautiful looking things? Do you want to give them something that's got a clear message within it or a sense of purpose? If you find that difficult, then pick out a brand that you really love yourself and unpick what the values are that are coming through in their brand story. So there are a number of different techniques you can use to pick up the things that you feel comfortable with. If it's a value you don't feel comfortable with, you shouldn't really be working with it.
Yes. Okay. That's interesting because the clearer you are, this is what I'm coming to understand. The clearer you are on what are your values, the easier it becomes to communicate to other people and to identify those people who might share them. And those are, as I understand it, those are your target audience, your ideal audience or customers, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, it's deeper than that, though, because the values that you hold are the energy behind your goals and all your actions. And if you're seeking to do something that is counter to your most deeply held values, you'll just run aground. You'll run out of energy. You'll begin to feel disillusioned. If you're working with your values and seeking to do things that sit nicely with your values, then you'll get on a lot better and make much more progress. So it runs into your own motivation as well.
I think that's great. That's a fantastic distinction, because that is something that hasn't necessarily been overt in some of the conversations I've had. We've been talking about values in terms of identifying who you want to sell your work to, or who do you want to communicate your message to, but not necessarily in terms of what actually makes the work self-sustaining and satisfying. Because yes, there will come a point, if you're going too far down something that is not a good fit, where you're going to start to feel false and inauthentic, and then that's going to cause a problem both for yourself as well as people are going to pick up on that and not respond to the work. So that's a really interesting distinction to make. Thank you. So I've got so many questions for you, Pete. So this might jump around a little bit. You use the word brand, and that's something that's come up a lot as well. We talk about everyone is a brand, everything is a brand, everyone needs to be a brand. And we also talk about the things that we make as being products. And I feel like these two words come from a very business and corporate vocabulary, and it doesn't often sit well with creative people. I don't want to see my art as a product, and I don't want to see myself as a brand, because that in a way almost devalues them. And I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on whether or not we need to adopt those terms,
Mm-hmm.
And is there a way of reframing them to make them more palatable? Or do we even need to
Yeah.
do that in the first instance?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you do need to do a bit of analysis around that. And one of the, when I'm working for Crafts Council with their makers, one of the big debates we always have is, are you trading as yourself, or are you trading as an entity? In other words, are you edging towards creating a brand for yourself? And there's often a great deal of confusion around that, because there's an authenticity that comes with just being yourself and having the u.com website, that sometimes gets lost when you just start producing product lines and having the brand.com website. And that conversation is really quite a personal one and runs quite deep for a lot of folk.
Absolutely. So is there a way of thinking, of structuring that decision making and making that distinction? When is it me? Because so many, I know certainly a lot of the people listening to this podcast are solo practitioners. They're working alone in their studios and they're creating work. And in a way that becomes a brand as well, in the same way that Andy Warhol is a brand, or Elvis is a brand, even though it's still an individual, but somehow it's come to encompass some very specific values and ideas. Where does the difference lie, and when is it better to trade as yourself, as Joe Blogs Ceramics, for example, versus the Blogs company Ceramics?
Yeah. If you're creating widgets, if you're creating a thing that gets produced in large quantities, so there's an element of manufacturing in it, or you're producing a service as a product, those tend to be the people that drift towards creating a brand identity for themselves. If they're producing just one-offs or working to commission or doing things where you just get one episode at a time, people tend to go towards working as themselves, because actually it's a deeply personal thing that they're creating. And the folk that will buy into that want to connect with the person. We all want to connect with warm human beings, in actual fact. And most people, when they go onto a company website, they tend to go straight to the About Us page or the company staff page, so they can see some headshots and see the real human beings behind the operation. It's a natural thing to do, because in actual fact, you as a creative person and your story, those things are the things that add value to the work over and above the value of the clay or the metal or the silver or the words that go into creating the product itself. Folk need personal connection. That's why I always recommend to creative people to whatever they do, have a really, really good About Me page with a really good headshot and a little bit of video of themselves maybe talking or working, because that's where the bonding occurs. That's where the beginning of a feeling of a relationship begins to occur. And folk need to feel that and trust that before they'll go any further in the process of getting to know the artist or moving towards thinking about buying the product.
That's a great practical step for people to consider it, because when I think of branding, and so much of what we're taught is you need to think of yourself as a brand. What are your brand values? What does the brand stand for? And I find that quite a cold exercise, and because I find the word quite distancing, because I find it hard to relate to as an individual and as a creative, to think of myself as a brand. But by sharing an image of yourself, a bit of information about who you are and why you do what you do, as well as, I love the idea of doing some video, because you can communicate so much information in a very short video of you just talking to whoever might be on the other side of that screen. You can convey so much of who you are, and it allows other people to almost identify for themselves what it is about you that they respond to, that they are drawn to, either in your motivation or the work that you create or the environment that you're in. And that's really interesting to do it that feels like a more genuine, authentic, and more human way
Yeah.
And it's not even about selling or selling yourself. It's simply about
No, no.
communicating who you are and allowing other people to make their own judgment.
Well, yeah. Again, there's a deeper level to this, which is to do with the psychology of connection. And it's only, there's no accident that public speaking and video are the number one and number two connectors of people to ideas. When you listen to somebody speak or when you watch a video of somebody talking, there's a process called neural coupling that takes place. And neural coupling is when the brains fall into sync with each other.
Oh,
And there's a mirroring of brain activity takes place.
really?
And it's that
I was not aware of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, if you Google the neuroscience of storytelling, there's a lot of documentary evidence around that, where they've used magnetic resonance imaging scanning to watch what's going on in people's brains when they're talking to each other, watching a video, or even actually looking at photographic stills of human beings. The empathy centers fire up and come into play. And of course, with the empathy, you get the trust, and that's where the beginning of the relationship occurs.
Brilliant. Yes. So that's absolutely fascinating. And it sounds like a much more manageable way of approaching this idea of communicating who you are to a potential audience. So one of the other areas that I was very interested in speaking to you about was you talk about on your website seeing your quietness and your introversion, or even lack of confidence as a strength. And I'd love to hear you speak more about that, and because those are often considered weaknesses and obstacles that get in the way of being a successful artist or successful anything. That we're always told you have to be confident, you have to put yourself out there, you have to put yourself forward, you have to claim space. So I'd love to hear your take on how those can actually be a strength.
If you think of it this way, and go back to the thing about shared values, there are people for whom modesty is a very, very attractive characteristic. And again, there are scientific studies done around this. People receive on a whole range of different levels, and there are people whose receivers are tuned into a quieter message and a more modest message, and people that don't tune into that stuff at all. Your audience is never going to be everybody. And if you are a quiet person, that it's therefore a strength, because actually the people that are looking for what you're doing and the qualities around what you're doing are likely to be quieter people who are going to empathize with that anyway. If you try and behave like an extrovert, actually what you're doing is pushing away the very people that would be most naturally drawn towards you if you simply be yourself and behave in your normal, quiet way. But there are lots of different ways that you can put yourself out there as a quiet person without having to worry about that.
Well, yes, that was my next question, is because you also talk about letting people discover your strengths without shouting about them, which is essentially, as I understand it, what the art of shouting quietly is about. And again, that sounds completely counterintuitive, and so counter the prevailing message of everyone has to promote themselves. They have to, we've got this wonderful wealth of social media and all these channels where you can reach every person on the planet. All you have to do is start an Instagram account, start a YouTube channel, and you can reach the world. But it does require a certain degree of effort and extroversion. And I'm curious to know then, how do you see it working with getting people to discover you? Because again, that's also the fundamental thing that I'm coming up. It comes up a lot, is that you can't sit in your studio and wait for people to come to you. As you said yourself, we would all love a gallery to show up or a patron to show up and someone to discover us and then just make it all easy. That's not going to happen. But if that is the skills of self-promotion or the confidence to promote yourself in these very public ways doesn't fit well with you, what is the alternative?
Okay, I'm going to just use one particular example here, which is about how you can use other people's voices to put your message over for you. If you're if you're not a big salesy person, get a blogger to write something about your work, get a magazine to feature your work, find a journalist or an editor who's interested in what you're doing, because that then lends credibility and a kind of platform for your work without you having to do the shouting. The next question is, how do you get in touch with those people? Well, you start well in advance. Get yourself onto a platform like Twitter and seek out the editors and the journalists that are writing articles that are kind of like the articles that you would like to be featured in, and spend quite a bit of time researching and tracking them down. You could even go to a big bookshop and look at all the magazines and find the magazines where you think you'd like to be featured, and take a note of the journalist's name. They're often freelance journalists. Track them down on Twitter and then just quietly follow them. As you follow them, you'll become more familiar with their output. You can start liking their posts. If you like something that they've written particularly, you can comment on that and have a little bit of a conversation with them. And what happens is they notice that you're there. They notice who you are and what you're doing. And as often as not, if you follow a journalist on Twitter, they'll have a look at your website. I certainly did when I was business editor for Craft and Design magazine. Anybody that followed me on a social media platform, the first thing I would do would be to go and look at their website and see their work and how interesting it was. Now, what you're doing there through that very quiet conversation and using the social media as a means to make gentle contact is you're warming up a relationship. And then when the time comes that you want somebody to pay attention and write an article about you, which may be a couple of months or even a year later, they know who you are, and you can send them a message and say, hey, I've been following you for a while. I really like the style that you write in. Might you be interested in looking at my work? And sometimes it works the other way around. They'll notice you and they'll come to you.
Which would be the ideal, I think, for, for many of us. Yeah. Fantastic, yes. And there's nothing. The word that comes to mind is duplicitous, but I think it's too pejorative a term. But it almost sounds calculated to approach it in that way. Is that just the way the world works, or am I taking too negative a take on that?
Yeah, in the history of the universe, we've never had that opportunity before. Is it any more calculating than compiling a database of journalists and pestering them with emails without any prior contact whatsoever in a very busy inbox when they're tearing their hair out trying to meet some deadlines? I don't think so. I think beginning to warm up a relationship in that way is actually a much more delicate way to go around things. Bumping into people on LinkedIn, watching what's going on there. LinkedIn is an incredibly powerful platform for creative people now. Since Microsoft took it over, they've changed it completely, and it's no longer just the domain of headhunters and job seekers. There are many, many more creative people on there, seeking out others that share their values.
And I think, as well as you say, in the example that you gave, is that if you're actually retweeting content from someone that you're interested in making contact with, you are actually helping them spread their work and their message. So it isn't a one-sided thing. You're actually of service to them, and then there's the potential of something coming back. So it's a more balanced equation. So here's a question that, again, comes back to this idea of self-promotion. If we're finding a way that we're starting to feel comfortable with letting people know about our work, a question that came back from a listener to the podcast was about plagiarism, in that we are often encouraged as creatives to share not only the work that we have already made, but the process by which we make that work. And now with all the social media channels that we have, the audience for that is enormous, and there's no accountability. So how would you answer the question of an artist being concerned about sharing work in progress, and then by doing so making themselves vulnerable to plagiarism, to someone stealing their ideas?
Okay, I mean, I think to a certain extent, plagiarism is much less common than we imagine it to be. So there's an element of fear there that isn't 100% on the scale that it should be. Folk worry about it a little bit too much. The other thing is the creative community is constantly watching each other's backs for evidence of plagiarism. And you'll have noticed now that anytime a designer gets their ideas pinched, the whole of the rest of the creative community are on the back of the company that's stolen the idea almost overnight and doing something active about it. And that's a whole new possibility that's come around. But then there's the big paradox about it. If you don't put it out there, how will people find you?
Yes.
And get interested in buying the work? The other thing, technically, of course, is that the very act of putting your work on the internet and date stamping the photographs, you need to make sure there's tags on the photographs that show they belong to you and record the date and time that they were put up there. That's an act of creating your own copyright. It's a bit like putting your image in an envelope and sending it to yourself, which used to be the old-fashioned way of doing it. So you know, I hate seeing people put watermarks over their work. It's much better just to put a high enough resolution image up so that people can see clearly what it is, but not so high resolution that if somebody takes it, it's usable to them in a different way. It'll just become pixelated and blurry if they start using it in real life. So there's a whole range of things you can do. But I would encourage people to be brave and do it. And then if and when the problem comes along, there are channels through which you can deal with that.
Brilliant. And that's again, a fantastically practical solution. A point that you made, or something that you've also identified in your writing, is you've talked about self-confidence as being mercurial, as something that isn't a constant. It's not at a constant level. It fluctuates all the time.
Yeah.
And that really resonated with me, because it was like, oh, that's so nice to hear someone recognize that, because there are times when, yes, I feel like, whoa, I can take on the world and I'm the most confident person out there. And the very next day or a phone call later or an email later, and it's completely gone. It's just completely crumbled. How do we, particularly as we're starting to, if we are starting to promote our work and put it out there, we're exposing ourselves to more feedback and possible criticism. How do we develop a more robust sense of self-confidence so that we aren't at the whim of maybe even an offhand comment that might show up in your Twitter feed or on your Facebook page?
Yeah. I think the first thing is avoiding comparisonitis, but that, I mean, avoiding looking at other people and believing that they're super confident beings, because we're all exactly the same. All of our confidence ebbs and flows. It doesn't matter whether you're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company or an individual artist working in Watford in the UK. We all suffer from the same fluctuations. The other thing is that the confidence it's not a continuum from I have no confidence to I am supremely confident being. We all pop up in different areas with our confidence, and we're much better at some things than others. I mean, I always am happy to speak to 200 people, but if you put me on a table at a dinner party, I clam up. You know, that's not the right place for me to shine. And it's about finding the place where you can really shine, which might be on Instagram or might be doing podcasts on SoundCloud, and really focusing on the place where you can really shine. And then that fact that you know you're in a good place, a place where you can function really well, where you're getting good results, to some extent will help you offset any kind of mishaps that you have. Again, in the world that we're living in and talking about, we're not really in the world of trolling. That's something else, and unfortunately that's happening far too much in mainstream news channels and on folk that are, you know, maybe more politically engaged. But when it comes down to simpler acts of creativity, I think you're more likely to encourage support and applause for what you're doing than you are really to attract any negativity. Not to say it might not happen, but remember the statistics are on your side, if you like.
Oh, that's fantastic. Because yes, I think it's easy to lose perspective when you
Yeah,
hear the stories of awful things that have
yeah,
happened and
yeah,
the consequences, to think,
yeah,
oh, that could be me.
yeah,
But that
yeah.
they
The
do
majority of people are good and kind.
that. That's a really nice thing to remind us of. Absolutely,
Hmm.
because a lot of media would tends to influence our thinking that that's not the
Yeah,
case.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
fantastic.
Well, Winston Churchill used to say, if you don't like the news, don't read it,
Mm, yep,
you know, and it's worth reminding ourselves that we don't have to get sucked up in this stuff,
absolutely.
you know.
Yeah, and I think that also fits with another element that's been coming up across this series is the idea of finding a community, a group of people who
Mm,
perhaps share your values or at least share your goals and your interests, so that you
yeah,
can be mutually supportive and remind yourself and each other of
yeah,
what it is that is important and matters to you, so that you can
mm,
maintain. Well, I think there are many benefits, but I think in this context, there's also the benefit of maintaining some perspective on the
yeah,
wider world, because there is a community that you can come back to that does
yeah,
give you support, reassurance, can
yeah,
bolster you when you are suffering from
yeah.
from the tides of life. Are there are there any living artists that you feel exemplify some of the things that you're talking about? Artists that perhaps we don't even know that they are quiet or introverted, but are still succeeding as creatives in the marketplace or in the wider world.
You know what? If you were to go onto Google and to just, I've done this and it works. Go onto Google and you Google introvert actor
Hmm.
or introvert artist, you'll start getting the most astonishing results. The one example I would use is Tom Hanks,
Mm.
who just is a deep, 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 deep introvert. And, you know, you watch the films, would you believe that? No, not necessarily, but that's the place where he shines. Everywhere else, he's just this quiet, gentle man, you know. So go and have a look, and I think you'll find you've got, you know, if you're introverted or shy, you've got lots of really good company. If you're anxious before you get to go and do a talk, Google nervous actors, and you're going to find a load of West End actors who some of them would admit to being physically ill before they go on stage, you know. And what they've done is they've not conquered the fear. They've just learned to live with it, and that's what we do, isn't it? You know, we become friends with our fears and learn to work with them, and that's how you get through what it is you need to do.
Absolutely. And I think every time you do it, you are reminding yourself that
Yeah,
you can.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
but it has to be something that you practice.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I've I've done many live performances and
Hmm.
performances on camera, and yeah, there's always that moment just before
Yeah,
you
yeah,
exit the wings onto the stage, or someone
yeah,
says action, where you're like, what am I doing?
yeah,
And but
yeah,
you just
yeah.
have to you if you what I find certainly is, if I stop at
Hmm.
that point, if I give myself the opportunity to not do it, it actually gets harder to go back the second time. Whereas
Yeah,
if I it's
yeah,
I'm the same way if it comes to jumping into a swimming pool. If I think the water's
yeah,
cold, uh,
yeah.
I can't inch in. I have to jump in, because otherwise it'll take me an hour to get from my toe to my shins.
That's right. Yeah,
So there's something about
yeah,
committing and pushing through.
mhm,
And I
yeah,
think particularly as well, thinking about why you're doing it, what's on the other side. Is this really
yeah,
worth doing?
yeah,
If you're not interested in swimming, then there's no point making yourself get into the cold water. But if you are, and you know you're going to feel the benefit of having had done it, then it is
yeah,
worth pushing through. So
yeah,
if you're not
yeah,
invested in a career on the West End, then
yeah,
maybe it's not worth doing it. But if that's
yeah,
really what you want to do, then
yeah,
uh, then reminding yourself of that end goal can bolster your confidence or your commitment to pushing through the
yeah.
discomfort.
Absolutely. I think it's the setting of the greater goal that enables you to sort of to bear the discomfort. So, for instance, people often get stuck in procrastinating about updating their website because all they're thinking about is the website, the website, the website. Once you remind them that once they've got the website, they're going to communicate with a big wide world of people, they're going to get more customers for themselves, their business will thrive as a benefit of that, then the interest in doing the website increases. It's just a task along the way to getting something that's really valuable. So I often work with people in just distinguishing what that greater goal is that will give them the motivation to do the boring stuff.
Absolutely. I think, I think it's extraordinary, the power of shifting perspective and reframing and what we choose to focus on, and how that can change how we feel and our motivation. Absolutely. And our sense of confidence, our sense of self varies tremendously. Again, that's kind of why I keep coming back to the question of the vocabulary that we use when it comes to talking about the work that we create in a marketing context. Am I making art or am I making a product? Am I an artist or am I a brand? And trying to find ways to reframe those so that they aren't necessarily contradictory ideas. I may be an artist and a brand. I make art, and that art is a product, and becoming comfortable with that. And then that makes the next step a little bit easier. So so that then it becomes, now I need to connect this art or product with an audience, which are actually buyers, because I can't deny the fact that there will be money involved in this sequence at some point if I want to earn an income from my work. And that's another thing I have to keep coming back to is remembering that it's a choice to try to make a living, to earn money from your creative practice. And you can choose to not do that, and that's totally valid. But if you choose to go down that route, then you do have to grapple with these things.
I think also one big mistake that people make is trying to make their mind up too soon about these things.
Oh, that's interesting.
And actually, you really, really only discover the right channel for yourself and the right story for yourself once you've tested it out. You need to test a load of different things to see what works, to see what attracts people, to see what pushes people away, what medium to use, what channel to use. And only then have you got enough feedback to begin to construct the kind of exoskeleton of your company or brand, if that's what you want. I was working with somebody a couple of months ago, and they were talking about spending an unseemly amount of money on building a website, but they hadn't really figured out who they were and what they wanted to do yet. And the metaphor I used is, well, it looks like you're building a cruise ship, when actually what you need at the moment is a canoe. You need something much more agile to move around and test things out. And then if the activity and the tests point you in the direction that you need a cruise ship, that's fair enough. But actually, you might end up needing a canal barge or something else entirely.
That's a fantastic example. It reminds me as well of the idea of doing experiments, of taking for a period of time a particular focus and just trying it out, treating it as an experiment. If I do X, Y, or Z for the next 30 days or 90 days, and not be too invested in what comes out the other end. It's not like this is absolutely what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. This is just what I'm going to try for this short period of time and see if it makes a difference, if it moves me in a direction that I do want, or it moves me in a direction that I don't like, or maybe that it's neither. But at least I've tried something, and I have information to make my next decision on. I've heard somebody talking about it as triangulation. If you only have one perspective, you don't know where you are until you move to another position, or you take another action, and then you can compare the two and go, oh, okay, is this where I want to be? Or maybe I need to be in that third place over there. But until you move or take action, you don't have enough information to really make a decision. That's fantastic. Again, a great practical thing to be thinking about is take some action. At least then you can make an informed decision.
It does.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing is, each year I do a project with Hereford College of Art, working with their MA students. And the MA students have to complete a business plan. in order to pass the course.
Mm.
And the problem they had was the MA students were not interested in writing a business plan because it didn't connect. They weren't
Yep.
interested in
Yep.
tax or anything like that. So they asked me to come in and see if they could resolve this problem. And it's resolved by saying to them, let's not write a business plan yet. Let's think about the lifestyle that you want from this creative life, and then figure out what it is you need to do to achieve that. And in answering those questions, we'll come up with a business plan that's unique to you. So you're not starting with the tax and the national insurance and the cash flow projection. You're starting with something that's much closer to their heart, that's motivating, that excites them. And that's really where you need to start. It's starting from the heart of what you really want and the lifestyle you want from doing what you do.
And that brings us back to that constantly reminding yourself of what is the wider goal? What are we trying to achieve in the long run? So yes, there might be sticky bits in between, but they become worthwhile when you hold on to this bigger vision of what am I working towards and what does this mean to me? So yes, having to do your own accounts, but I also get to, I don't have to go into someone else's job. I can work for myself. There's freedom that comes from that, those kinds of things. Brilliant. So Pete, I know we're coming close to time. I'd like to ask you about this new book that you're working on. So you've written 2 books previously, Make Your Creativity Play and Making Your Creativity Pay. That might be a Freudian slip. And The Art of Shouting Quietly. So what's the 3rd book exploring?
Well, I've only got a working title for the first book, which is it's Where the Magic Happens, and it's to do with. It's not just aimed at introverts. This one, it's aimed at everyone, and it's around the notion of audience building, and it's around the notion of establishing credibility. It's around the notion that we all have stories going on in our heads all the time about ourselves and our confidence and our capabilities of doing things. And then we also have the stories that we need to tell other people in order to attract them towards our work. Now, sometimes those sets of stories come into conflict with each other, and we end up with things we need to solve or reframe or think about really hard, so that when we do get up and talk to other people or we do write stuff about our work, it's coherent and it's authentic, and it really does transmit our values very clearly. That's the kind of core of the idea of the 3rd book.
That's fantastic, because I think you're putting your finger again on something that's very interesting. Is I need to convince these people that I'm the person for the job. I can handle that commission. I can make this happen. In fact, that's a really good example. I spoke to Jo Downs recently. She's a glass artist working in fused glass. And she talks about when she's presented with a new commission, that she'll say yes, but inside she's saying, I don't know how I'm going to do that, because it's always a new challenge. It's a new stretch. But in that moment of talking to the person who has the commission, there is a disconnect between what she's feeling inside, but what she has to put out on the outside. And I don't want to put words into her mouth, but I think it's something that we've all experienced, that you need to convey to whoever you're talking about that you can do, are capable of X, Y, or Z, but on the inside there might be a sense of disease or uncertainty. And those stories are in conflict, and it'd be fantastic to hear how you help us resolve that.
Okay, well, that's the work in progress, and I'm going to provide the link to the website where those articles are starting to come alive.
Brilliant.
And people can go and have a look at the work in progress.
Excellent. I think that'll be absolutely fascinating and hugely valuable, as well as this conversation has been. Before we go, Pete, is there an action step or a challenge that you'd like to set for listeners?
Yeah, I'm a great believer of building confidence in tiny steps. And my question would be, how can you be a little bit braver every day? By that, I mean just recognizing that you step out of your comfort zone, which is where, after all, most of us spend most of our lives, and just do something that's just a little edgy or a little uncomfortable, but something that might just give you a little bit of pleasure out of having experimented with it. Because that experience of getting the pleasure from doing something that's a little bit uncomfortable actually it changes the memory of your level of confidence and enables you to grow your confidence step by step. I mean, I'll often do something like just striking up a conversation with a total stranger at the checkout in the supermarket, because that's out of my normal sphere of normal conversation, but doing it makes you feel really nice, actually. Being warm and friendly with another human being that you've never spoken to before. And it just makes you feel better about your conversations with the rest of humanity. There's all sorts of different things you can try. If you're good at speaking with one person, speak with two people or a small group of people. Set yourself a tiny challenge almost every day, and it has a remarkable effect.
I love that, because it's immediately actionable. It's not a grand, big gesture or huge, overwhelming challenge. And I love the way that you frame it as something that will actually make you feel good for having had done it. Because I think we are often challenged to stretch and grow and to take on bigger challenges, but they can be so big that they are overwhelming, or they can be terrifying to consider. Whereas if you go into it with the intention of actually something that's going to feel good when I come out the other side, that again, that's a wonderful reframe, and it changes the way that we then approach it. So we're not doing it with trepidation. We're actually coming into it with something like, oh, actually this, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but the outcome will be positive. I think that's fantastic and absolutely perfect. So
brilliant.
If people want to find more about you and your work, what's the best place to find you online?
Twitter, really. It's twitter.com/Pete Mosley, where you get access to just about everything that I do, because I post about it regularly. If they're of the mind to link up on LinkedIn, I'm very happy to be linked up with on there. And most of what I do, unfortunately, is accessible simply by typing my name into Google, because everything ends up there in the search results. My website is petemosley.com. Between those things, you'll find everything that's worth finding.
Perfect. Absolutely fantastic. Pete, this has been such a great and inspiring conversation. You've given us so many things to think about, and so many practical things, which is absolutely wonderful. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to call the podcast The Practical Creative, is that I'm looking for actions that I can take, that listeners can take, that move us forward, if it's in our own practice, our own mindset, our developing skills in any number of possible avenues. Instead of just talking about it, is finding things that we can physically do. We can go out into the world and try, because that's ultimately how we learn and develop these new skills and mindsets. So and this conversation has been absolutely full of all of that. So I can't thank you enough for making the time to speak with me, and just thank you so much.
Okay, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for calling me up. It's been really great talking to you this afternoon.
Hey there, thanks for taking the time to listen to this episode of The Practical Creative. If you'd like to learn more about Pete and his work, you can visit the Practical Creative website at thepracticalcreative.life, where you'll find more about him and links to his materials. And if you'd like to have a go at Pete's challenge of building confidence, you can find a written version on the Creative Challenges page. Just head on over to the website and check it out. And while you're there, also be sure to check out the resources page, where I've compiled links to all the materials and services referenced by my guests, including books they've written on creativity and business, online courses, Facebook groups, and some of my top recommendations for learning more about selling and sharing your work. And if you've enjoyed this episode of the Practical Creative Podcast, it would be fantastic if you would subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, and even leave a review on iTunes. I'd also love to hear from you about what you found to be exciting, inspiring, or even challenging about these conversations. You can contact me directly via the website at thepracticalcreative.life. Until next time.